Gospel of Judas, a gospel that portrays Judas, the famous betrayer of Jesus in the New Testament, as somehow having secret knowledge about who Jesus really was.
Imagine stumbling on a book that could rewrite the history of Christianity as we know it. A book so powerful that it threatens the entire story of Jesus Christ's death and resurrection, and vindicates one of history's most despised villains. This is the Gospel of Judas, the ancient text that paints a new perspective on the betrayal story, and makes Judas a hero instead of a villain. Did Judas really sell Jesus out, or has his story been grossly misunderstood for centuries? Join us on this adventure of a lifetime, as we open up the Lost Gospel of Judas, exploring the untold story of the disciple who betrayed Jesus. The intertwined story of Jesus and Judas. Miracle worker, Son of God, King of the Jews. These are few titles given to Jesus Christ the Nazarene during his lifetime and beyond. His story is one of the most retold tales in history, one of the most disputed, and perhaps even the most controversial. While his life was punctuated by miracles, heart-rending teachings, and bold prophecies that still resonate with millions around the world today, his death is possibly one of the most talked-about executions since the inception of mankind. But it's impossible to discuss the accounts of Jesus' death without introducing one of the central characters of this historical lore, Judas Iscariot. As one of the 12 members of Jesus' inner chamber, known as the disciples, Judas was a prominent figure in the movement spearheaded by the famed King of the Jews. But beyond the service rendered to Jesus, and his role as the financial manager of his movement, Judas is mostly remembered as the man who sold Jesus out for 30 pieces of silver, which is about $450 in today's money. As prominent as Judas is, though, his story is only told by others, mostly because he took his own life shortly after Jesus went to the cross, and in part because he was the villain in the whole story. You see, most of what we know about the life of Jesus the prophet from Nazareth comes from the accounts of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, 4 of Jesus' closest disciples, and major members whose documentation has helped us piece together the story of how Jesus Christ lived and died. It was also through their writing that we caught a glimpse of Judas's role in the capture and crucifixion of Jesus. But while this narrative about the disciple who sold out remained unchallenged for years, the early 21st century ushered in new revelations that depicted a different story entirely, a plot where Judas wasn't a villain, but a hero. The Gospel of Judas. Nearly 1,700 years ago, an unknown author documented a strange piece of writing, challenging the ideologies and beliefs of Christianity. It was in the 1970s when archaeologists first stumbled on this leather-bound papyrus codex, while exploring a cave in the desert near El Minya, Egypt. Thanks to the unique Egyptian climate, the script was found in relatively good condition, although it had been lying there for like a lifetime. This book, which archaeologists believe was originally written in ancient Greek, was translated into Coptic language around 300 AD, and it tells an entirely different story about Jesus, the other disciples, and Judas himself. In this version of events, Judas isn't portrayed as the backstabbing disciple, but as Jesus' favorite follower, who was persuaded by Jesus himself to help him get rid of his limiting earthly body. As soon as the script was discovered, it began a long and complicated journey, trading hands from one antique trader to the other, and traveling from Egypt to Europe, before eventually landing in the United States. High-value antiques often attract high prices, and this final owner wasn't willing to part with the script without snatching a few $1,000,000 in return. Christian scholars sought to get their hands on this piece of biblical history, but the price tag was way too high. So the script was left to languish in a safe deposit box located in Long Island, New York for 16 years. But all that changed in the year 2000, when a Zurich-based antique dealer named Frieda Nussberger Chaks acquired it, finally freeing it from the box. Unfortunately, the New York weather wasn't exactly as suitable as the Egyptian cave where the script laid preserved for over 1,000 years, and by the time it was recovered from the safe deposit box, the etchings had seriously faded, many lines and sections were lost, and the overall quality of the manuscript significantly reduced. After several failed attempts to resell the manuscript for a profit, Chakos decided to hand it over to the Maecenas Foundation for Ancient Art, located in Basel, Switzerland, kickstarting the long and arduous translation process. To access the secret tales locked away in this ancient text, Rodolphe Kasser, one of the world's leading Coptic scholars, was called in. He identified that along with the Gospel of Judas, there was also a text titled The First Apocalypse of James, as well as a separate letter from Peter to Philip, and even a fragment of a fourth text scholars now call the Book of Allogenes. As for the Gospel of Judas itself, its only surviving script was unveiled by the National Geographic on April 6, 2006, and currently sits in the Coptic Museum in Cairo. Prior to this discovery, the only time a gospel belonging to Judas was ever mentioned in historical context was in the year 180 AD, when a man named Irenaeus, the Bishop of Lyons in France, wrote about a heretical scroll in his first book against heresies. The ancient theologian and Christian apologist described this particular material that was apparently circulating among the people at the time, saying, "And Judas, the betrayer, they say, had got a thorough knowledge of these things, and he alone, knowing the truth above all the others, accomplished the mystery of the betrayal. Through him, all things, both earthly and heavenly, have been dissolved, as they say. And they adduce a composed work to this effect, which they call the Gospel of Judas." He then describes the writing as fictitious history and blasphemous heresies. And although it's quite impossible to determine whether Irenaeus's comment was directed at this same scroll in our possession, his description might be very close to the truth. It is also worth noting that this gospel was not written by Judas Iscariot himself, as it appeared a whole generation after his death. As for the true identity of the writer, that remains an unsolved mystery. After the National Geographic unveiled this scroll to the public in 2006, the subject of Judas's gospel became a widely debated enigma due to its potential to alter the established narrative of Jesus' death and resurrection, and its intentional attempt at exonerating Judas the betrayal. Many have described it as a Gnostic gospel, with ideas that stand in polar opposite to the original gospel, and by studying the narrative peddled by Judas's supporters, it isn't hard to see why. Into the unknown. The Gospel of Judas begins with a tagline indicating that this was the secret account of the revelation that Jesus spoke in conversation with Judas Iscariot during a week 3 days before he celebrated Passover. Going by the accounts of the original Gospel and established historical accounts, Jesus' crucifixion took place a few hours before this all-important Jewish holiday, so this means the said conversations took place in the days leading to his death. However, it contradicts the kind of interaction Jesus actually had with the disciples according to the other Gospels. In the broad sense, this Gospel is divided into several sections, with the first showcasing Jesus' interaction with the disciples and the selection of Judas as the most pious and knowledgeable of the disciples who would carry out the biggest assignment of sending Jesus to the cross. According to this Gospel, when Jesus appeared on earth, he performed miracles and great wonders for the salvation of humanity. And since some walked in the way of righteousness while others walked in their transgressions, the 12 disciples were called. He began to speak with them about the mysteries beyond the world and what would take place at the end. These first few lines seem to fall in alignment with the narrative of the other Gospels, but in the very next paragraph, this Gospel delves into a strange interaction between Jesus and his disciples, where he finds them praying and begins to laugh at them for some unexplained reason. One day he was with his disciples in Judea, and he found them gathered together and seated in pious observance. When he approached his disciples, gathered together and seated and offering a prayer of thanksgiving over the bread, he laughed. The disciples said to him, "Master, why are you laughing at our prayer of thanksgiving? We have done what is right." He answered and said to them, "I am not laughing at you. You are not doing this because of your own will, but because it is through this that your God will be praised." This exact line is one of the strangest claims made by the Gospel of Judas. And although it would be put into more context later on in the text, the idea of Jesus referring to his disciples' God as your God contradicts the message propagated by him during his lifetime and his disciples after his death. For example, in the accounts of John chapter 14, Jesus gathered his disciples for a teaching session, explaining the Christian divinity and answering some of the deepest questions posed by his followers. When a disciple named Thomas asked him to show them the way to God, he replied saying, "I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you really know me, you will know my Father as well." Then another disciple named Philip pitched in and asked, "Lord, show us the Father and it will be enough for us." Jesus responded by saying that, "Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, 'Show us the Father'? Don't you believe that I am in the Father and that the Father is in me?" So, if Jesus had talked about his oneness with God, why then would he refer to him as your God? This confusion was further echoed by his disciples, who according to the Gospel of Judas asked him, "Master, you are the Son of our God." But in response, Jesus said to them, "How do you know me? Truly I say to you, no generation of the people that are among you will know me." Considering John's account quoted earlier, this was a direct contradiction of his teachings. However, the rabbit hole goes even deeper, because in the next line, Judas's gospel paints the disciples as extremely angry men, whose hearts burned with fury due to Jesus' reprimand, and they began blaspheming against him in their hearts. While this didn't align with their character, one particular disciple was presented as the all-knowing, who came out to prove to Jesus he knew exactly who he was. That disciple was Judas. After Jesus challenges any one of them willing to stand before him with a pure heart and reveal who he truly was, Judas steps out and says, "I know who you are and where you have come from. You are from the immortal realm of Barbelo, and I am not worthy to utter the name of the one who has sent you." Right off the bat, this raises many questions that aren't addressed in the other Gospels, and establishes why both ancient theologians like Irenaeus and modern theologians classify the Gospel of Judas as heresy. Who is Barbelo? What was the relationship between Jesus of Nazareth and this strange being? What immortal realm was Judas referring to in this passage? The answer to these questions takes us into a whole different world, the world of Gnosticism, the Gnostic concept of divinity. One of the most important questions to ask when studying the Gospel of Judas and how it related to the death of Jesus is whether this was a Christian text accepted by the Church, or a separate writing originating from a whole different source. Unlike the writings of the other 4 disciples documented in the canonical Bible, the Gospel of Judas is regarded as a Gnostic writing, deeply rooted in Gnostic beliefs and its spiritual teachings. Understanding this will help us approach the stories and claims in the script with a better background. Originally, the canon of the Bible was put together during the first few centuries of the Church, with the final proclamation being made by Pope Innocent I in the year 405 AD. Before that time, several other Gospels were in circulation, claiming to have been inspired just like the writings of the Apostle, with ideas that demonstrated just how vast and complex the Christian faith was at the time. It was during this era that the Gospel of Judas emerged from what could be described as a branch of Christianity known as Christian Gnostics. History has recorded very little about this religion, so there's a common misunderstanding that it was a rival form of early Christianity. However, according to many sources, it was a completely distinct religion that actually predated Christianity by some time. While they may not have been considered heretics at the time, many theologians believe they were not actually Christians. You see, Gnosticism actually originated from an Iranian cult, but over time they began borrowing Greek philosophy and the teachings of Plato, as well as other religions like Judaism and mystery cults that emerged after the coming of Jesus. However, it is essential to point out that the religion wasn't called Gnosticism until the emergence of Christianity, even though its ideologies had been propagated for many years before Jesus was even born. So, what's the difference between Gnosticism and Christianity? That answer is also very broad and inexhaustible, but for the sake of this video, one key element we'll explore is the dualistic belief or the existence of multiple gods. The Bible is clear on this subject of a singular God, like in 1 Corinthians chapter 8 verse 6, where it says, "Yet for us there is one God, the Father, from whom are all things and for whom we exist, and one Lord, Jesus Christ." However, Gnostics' beliefs differ greatly from this narrative. To put it in the simplest terms possible, everything that was created originated from a supreme being known as Monad, Ion Telios, or Bythos, among many other names. This perfect God is regarded as the high source of the pleroma, the region of light where the fullness of the Godhead exists, and through a process called emanation, several divine entities and realms emerged from him. Unlike the Supreme Being, many of these deities or aeons were flawed, and it was through their activities that the material world and mankind were created. Barbelo, as mentioned by Judas in the writing, is the name given to the first aeon that emanated from Monad, and the foremost inhabitant of the Pleroma, or simply heaven. Also known as Sophia, Barbelo is a feminine entity, which bears a striking semblance to the Christian depiction of the Holy Spirit, and is believed to have created our universe and the angels. She also makes an appearance in the Secret Book of John, another Gnostic text rejected by the Church, where she's portrayed as the mother of Christ, who embodied the pregnancy of the Virgin Mary to give birth to Jesus, the Son of God. So, the Gnostic Trinity sounds something like God the Father, or Monad, Barbelo, who's worshipped as his wife, and Jesus the Son. Sounds familiar, right? The big question, however, was how Judas possessed this form of knowledge, which the other disciples didn't know about. Remember how Peter was praised by Jesus for identifying him as the Son of the living God in Matthew chapter 16, from verses 16 to 20. Well, this role was reversed in the Judas manuscript, with him taking Peter's place. What all of this means was that Jesus was essentially laughing at the disciples for praying to a false god, which was one of the imperfect and evil aeons that emanated from the Monad, and that Judas was the only one who knew the one true God. Right after identifying that Jesus was from the realm of Barbelo, Judas was pulled aside, and thus began one of the most important conversations of his life. A conversation about how Jesus wanted Judas to betray him. Before we go on with the rest of the video, check out our subscribers' pick for today. Judas's shocking revelation about Jesus' death has just been revealed in old documents, and it could change everything we know and believed about Christianity, death, and resurrection, and the real reason Jesus came to this world. While the whole world depicts Judas as a betrayer, who sold his master for a measly sum, this mysterious book tells a whole different story, where Jesus himself encourages the disciple to deliver him swiftly to his enemies. While this book has been dismissed as an unfounded narrative, fueled by a sect of Christianity that didn't fully understand the true missions of Jesus, there are a select few who still hold on to this plotline as cold facts and reject the idea of faith and accepting enlightenment as the only means of salvation. Join the discussion and share your thoughts with us as well. Do you think the Gospel of Judas is a concrete historical text, or a made-up story to clean up the reputation of history's most villainous characters? Hero or villain? Knowing that Judas was reflecting upon something that was exalted, Jesus said to him, "Step away from the others, and I shall tell you the mysteries of the kingdom. It is possible for you to reach it, but you will grieve a great deal, for someone else will replace you, in order that the 12 disciples may again come to completion with their God." Judas said to him, "When will you tell me these things? And when will the great day of light dawn for the generation?" But when he said this, Jesus left him. With this, Jesus informed Judas that his destiny was to be replaced by another person after completing the task of outing him, a task he was destined to accomplish. But like Judas mentioned, this was an incomplete revelation. However, the rest would eventually come later in another conversation. This time, it was during a general dialogue between the rabbi and the rest of the disciples, who wanted some clarifications on the visions they saw in their sleep. According to the Gospel of Judas, after Jesus attended to the other disciples and interpreted their visions, Judas said, "Master, as you have listened to all of them, now also listen to me, for I have seen a great vision." When Jesus heard this, he laughed and said to him, "You 13th spirit, why do you try so hard? But speak up, and I shall bear with you." Judas said to him, "In the vision, I saw myself and the 12 disciples were stoning me and persecuting me severely." He then goes on to talk about the rest of the vision, which Jesus also interpreted. But that's not within the scope of our study. What is relevant, though, is the statement made by Judas, that he saw the other disciples stoning him. A statement which the Gnostic followers took for a fact back in the day, indirectly promoting Judas to martyrdom. You see, unlike other disciples and first-generation Christian leaders, who are celebrated in death and revered among the believers, Judas was considered a sellout, since his act of betrayal was widely known by everyone. Going by the accounts of the canonical Bible, Luke, Matthew, and John talk about Judas feeling an overwhelming remorse after he handed Jesus over. The guilt weighed so heavily on his mind that he proceeded to take his own life by hanging himself out in the fields. However, the Gospel of Judas asserts that he was actually stoned to death by the other disciples, after they found out he was the one who handed Jesus over to the authorities. Several theologians have noted how this seems to be a whitewashing attempt to make Judas appear more saintly than he actually was. And so they reject both the narrative and the script that propagated it. But that's not where the story ends, as Jesus himself would apparently confirm that Judas would simply be fulfilling an instruction by aligning with the enemy. But before we get into that, you should note that due to the damage the script has sustained from improper storage, few lines from this next passage have been lost, so to avoid misinformation, they were not interpreted. Therefore, it will simply read blank in those places, before proceeding with the rest of the lines. Here's what it says. As the day of Passover drew closer, Judas went to Jesus for clarifications on the fate of Jesus' disciples, saying, "Look, what will those who have been baptized in your name do?" Jesus then replied, "Truly I say to you, this baptism, blank, my name, blank, to me. Truly I say to you, Judas, those who offer sacrifices to Saklas, God, blank, everything that is evil. But you will exceed all of them, for you will sacrifice the man that clothes me." Considering the phrasing used by Jesus in this version of events, there's an obvious alignment with Gnostic ideologies, which further proves that this story may have been flawed by an already established counter-Christian movement. You see, Gnostics don't actually see Jesus as a savior in the sense that most traditional Christians do. While many believe and accept that Jesus Christ's death was to serve as a sacrifice to wipe away the sins of the world, Gnostics claim that Jesus was simply sent to enlighten mankind so their eyes could be opened and they could return to their true nature, which is rooted in divinity. To put it simply, Christians believe that mankind is inherently evil and born with a nature of sin, and could only be redeemed by the sacrifice of Jesus' blood. Gnostic Christianity preaches that the true nature of man is inherently good, that the spirit and body exist in duality, that the human spirit is perfect but forced to suffer due to the imperfect nature of the body. This way, man can only be saved by knowledge, which brings them to the understanding of their spiritual existence, and the only part Jesus plays is to bring that knowledge, providing enlightenment, which then translates into salvation. So, when Jesus said to Judas, "You will sacrifice the man that clothes me," the idea was that he would help him shed his physical nature, so he could exist only in his spiritual sense. This is also true because Gnostics believe that Jesus Christ's physical and spiritual natures existed and operated independently while he was on earth, and so his death was simply an escape rather than a sacrifice. So, according to Gnostics, Judas's action wasn't betrayal. Rather, it was his way of helping the rabbi translate from one form to another, and he apparently got consent to do this, proceeding with permission from Jesus himself. Not surprisingly, this view has been rejected many times since the Gospel of Judas first emerged in 2006. It was rejected back in the early days of Christianity, going by the writings of Irenaeus, and many still continue to disprove these claims as heretical. Several prominent theologians and scholars have traced the origins of this sect, one of whom was Elaine Pagels, a professor of religion at Princeton University, who said that the people who loved, circulated, and wrote down these Gospels did not think they were heretics. They believed they had really cracked the code of what Jesus' purpose was, and with texts like the Gospel of Judas, Thomas, Philip, and others, their message was spread far and wide. But the message of Judas's Gospel didn't just center on his death and resurrection. The book also delved into the story of creation, the true God of the physical realm, and its own version of how Adam and Eve came to be. Who is Saklas? Exploring the Gospel of Judas may produce more questions than answers, especially with the introduction of certain characters that were not included in the original Bible narrative. One of such prominent names who makes several appearances is Saklas. A good example of where he makes an appearance was when Jesus delved into the true story of creation, saying, "Then Saklas said to his angels, 'Let us create a human being after the likeness and after the image.' They fashioned Adam and his wife Eve, who is called in the cloud Zoe. For by this name all the generations seek the man, and each of them calls the woman by these names." Of course, The canonical Bible records this in a whole different light according to the book of Genesis. So, how did the deity Saklas get into the picture? Well, according to Gnostic beliefs, Saklas is a demiurge, responsible for the creation of the known universe. He's also known as Yaldabaoth, or Samael, or the blind god, and his name Saklas directly translates to the fool. Gnostics identify him as the God of the Old Testament, portrayed as ignorant, malicious, and utterly inferior to the true God who sent Jesus to save mankind from the demiurge. The Gospel of Judas paints the picture of a flawed deity who kept the people trapped in a world of horror and suffering prior to the coming of Jesus, and that the whole mission Jesus came to fulfill was to deliver freedom by knowledge. While massive publicity and hype followed as soon as Judas's gospel was translated to English, most theologians now shun the writing, its depictions of the disciples, especially Judas, the narrative about the death of Christ, and every other revelation contained within. It's been described as heretical, fanatical, and some even claim it's a pure work of fiction. Although the text has been studied by many scholars, it has made its way into a blacklisted library. However, its wild narrative continues to tickle our imaginations. Thank you for watching this video. See you in the next one.